So, have you had the experience where you have something going on in your life that you just think shouldn't be a problem anymore? And it can be really frustrating, like getting out of the door to get to school on time or to get to any appointment on time. That seemed to be a very large source of frustration for people that responded to this question of where are you experiencing challenges that you didn't think you'd be having anymore by now? It could even be seemingly simple things like brushing teeth, which can be bigger battles than you might have ever expected. So today on ADHD What Now, we are going to cover what to do in that situation, what is important. So my name is Veronica Hunter. I'm the hostess of ADHD What Now, and I'm always looking to further understand kids with ADHD and empower next steps for their support. So today we have Dr. Braaten, and it is an honor to have her here with us because she has some phenomenal experience specifically on this. She is an experienced and prominent psychologist. She's widely recognized as an expert in the field of pediatric neuropsychological and psychological assessment, particularly for assessing learning disabilities and attentional disorders. She holds appointments at Massachusetts General Hospital, as well as several other ones as associate professor, for example, at Harvard Medical School. She's written several articles that have been cited by NBC News, Attitude Magazine, Understood, Parents Magazine, and more. And she has an entire book on processing speed, which is one of the things that had me super attracted to her work, because I know how many times I have gotten assessments and they give me this number for processing speed and other numbers about my kids. And in the end, I'm like, great, I know this, but I honestly don't know exactly what to do with that. And so I think through the course of this conversation here, when we're talking about how do expectations and our experience in reality, what do we do with that? Some of that might come up and be a real help and aha moments for you to understand your kids and then better support them. So thank you for being here and welcome, Dr. Braaten. It is a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
So getting into this idea, then I gave an example of getting to school on time, right? And perhaps I know I've had this feeling like this shouldn't be so hard to get out the door and get someplace on time, but in reality, it's a big challenge. When people come to you with these types of challenges, and I'm sure they can be many and diverse, and frustrations, what do you want people to know? Like when you understand it, what becomes possible for that family that right now is really just in the thick of being frustrated and having anxiety or battles about those types of situations?
So I think you bring up a couple of really good points about where to start with this. And that is, you mentioned like, why is this happening? And it starts really with an expectation. A parent thinks like, my life is so hard. Things seem to be so hard. Things that are really simple that shouldn't be hard are hard. And the first thing that I recommend parents doing is to question your own goals and your own objectives. Most of the time, parents are right on the money, to be honest. Like there are certain things like getting to school on time, brushing your teeth. Those are sorts of things that should be automatic by the time a child is, school aged, but they aren't always. So one of the things you want to do though, is you want to think about for yourself, like, all right, I'm frustrated in these areas. You want to define it. You want to know what is it that's not happening, because it can sort of feel as a parent like just everything is going wrong. And you want to make sure that like, no, what's really not working is not brushing his teeth, or we're always late for school. And then the other layer to this is to figure out why the child's having trouble with this. So there could be a lot of different reasons. It could be ADHD. It could be, you mentioned slow processing speed. It could be problems with language processing. It could be problems actually with the routines that you've put into place. And I always recommend mapping out a schedule and having routines and doing things over and over the same way. But you might not be as regular with those things as you thought you were. So those are all things that, before you even get to the behavior itself, you want to make sure that the behavior you're asking your child to do is appropriate, that they can actually do it, and that you have already maximized the things that you could to help that happen. I find that parents get very frustrated that things don't happen right away. And that's the one thing we don't take into consideration with the developing brain, especially when a child has learning or attentional challenges, and especially with slow processing speed, which can make everything take longer. We don't realize how long it takes to learn those sorts of skills. So we get frustrated a lot sooner than we should. And, like we think, okay, we've got this beautiful schedule. It's, we feel like we're turning over a whole new leaf. And then within 5 days, it's not quite working. Instead of saying like, well, the schedule doesn't work, I'm frustrated, is to then kind of engage your child in this. And that's the other big piece, is that you need to be communicating with your child a lot. Like, okay, listen, brushing your teeth is not something that's negotiable. Getting to school on time is not something that's negotiable. There are lots of other things, but we need to do this together. And here's why. How do we do this? And you'd be surprised how much your child might be willing to say what he should do. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he will do it, but it is a good start. And so that's something, those are all things to sort of consider when you're in this situation. Almost every parent has been in, even parents of kids who don't have attention issues.
Mm-hmm. So true. So as you're talking then, the picture I'm getting in my head is almost like taking my vision where here I'm looking at what should be, right? And what are we going to do to get to where we should be, and shifting that vision to be like, where is this child right now? And what might they do to help bridge that gap from where we are right now to where we want to get to? Is that about right?
Exactly. And I think the other thing to consider is that kids are asked to do a lot of things that they're not prepared to do really in school. They're asked to manage a lot more stuff than I ever had to manage. When I was in school, we went to school with a lunchbox. And if you needed, if you had homework, it was in, one book that you brought home every day. They have to manage so much, which means you as parents have to manage so much. And so you want to take that into consideration, and also look at this as sort of like an experiment, and engage your child in that way. Like, how do we build this bridge? And be forthright. I'm feeling really frustrated. Like, I'm anxious, and you're not feeling great either. When my son was little, I tell the story all the time that at one point, I don't know, he's maybe in 3rd or 4th grade. And I said, we have to come up with a different way of getting your homework done without me yelling at you every night. And he said, well, yelling kind of works, Mom. And so it was one of those things where it's like, I had this aha moment where it's like, okay, what you need, I said, it doesn't make me feel good and you don't feel good either. And it only works for a little bit. So how do we take that? So there's something about that works because it's clear, how do we take that apart and make it different for you? And that's kind of one of the things when the expectations aren't being met. It's like, okay, so, let's find out a different way of doing this. And then you sort of like test these things out. You're constantly sort of looking at your goals and figuring out, is this working? Is it not? And reflecting that to your child too.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And a great example there. So one of the things that you bring up, or you mentioned 2 things that I loved. I've never read some of one, I'm reading your book, and then this article that you have on language processing as well, right? So, and how significant the ramifications of processing speed or language processing can be. So can you give some tips? Let's say those are kind of what's behind these challenges. Can you give some tips to help people see that or begin to develop a vision that notices and picks up on that a bit? Because I just find that when I understand that to some degree, it helps me to shift those expectations to a realistic level, and then really see the child for where they're at and help them along the journey. So what?
Absolutely. And, when I've presented data to parents, when I've tested a child, I've many times had parents say to me, oh, so it's just going to take him longer to get something done. that helps already. Like I've had that experience many times because it's so one of the things you can do is go and look if your child's been assessed, go and look to see is processing speed an issue, is language an issue? Because if it is, there are two things that can happen. One is with language processing in the morning, for example. Let's use this example of being, having to get ready in the morning. You're typically also anxious. You need to get somewhere as a parent on the same time, and you might be talking very quickly to your child. And a child with a language processing problem is not going to be absorbing that. In fact, it might just make them feel anxious and overwhelmed, which of course slows us down generally, or in the case of kids, sometimes makes them have a complete meltdown. So you want to make sure that the language you're using is language that they can understand, and you want to be monitoring your own sort of levels of stress and anxiety. And that's why making everything as routine and as boring and overdone as possible. Kids have to overlearn these skills. And even simple things like when you come into the house, you hang your jacket up. You don't just leave it on a chair somewhere. Those very small things that you can put into place help a child start to get organized for the afternoon. And so that's one thing. For processing speed, one of the things that you want to do is make sure your child has a good sense of time. So many kids with processing speed issues and ADHD in general have trouble with time perception, even knowing how much time is passing. And so if you don't really have a good perception of time, sort of like being colorblind in a way, and then being asked to match outfits. Well, if you can't tell the difference between red and green, you might not be matching things quite well. And the same thing for children with ADHD. Many of them have sort of this trouble with like knowing what is 15 minutes and what does that feel like versus 30 minutes. I even find it's the case even in the long term, the year, like what is, when is, how long is 3 weeks versus 3 months? They just sort of have a more difficulty with that. And so one of the things you can do is to really help them learn to tell time on an analog clock, time things out. So make sure that they understand, like, okay, let's time how long it takes you to brush your teeth. How long did it take you to get ready for school this morning? And not always in a punitive way. A lot of times we use timers in ways where it's like, okay, you have 15 minutes to get this homework done or you're going to be in trouble. But to really do it in sort of a fun way to develop that internal clock. Because if we're saying to them, it's 15 minutes till the bus comes, and they don't know what 15 minutes is, really, it's not that informative.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful. It's really helpful too that you're bringing into the conversation ways to look at it, because I feel like it takes so many different aspects to shift from just that state of frustration to coming into a calm place and being able to utilize tools and strategies. You have to learn what those tools are, and you have to like recognize or accept where you are in this current state, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of the tools are kind of boring in some ways. It's about doing the same thing every day, the shoes are in the same place every night. You take, all of those sorts of things to put into place are really important. But if your child doesn't get to bed on time, isn't getting enough sleep, if you haven't sort of like mapped out what can we prepare the day before, what can we do that morning, and then pile on top of that a child who's not really aware of, we really need to get going because we only have 5 minutes, it can make it really difficult.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. One more last question. How often did processing speed and ADHD overlap, or ADHD and language processing?
So in our research, it shows that about 60% of kids with ADHD will have processing speed issues, slower processing speed. So it's a fair number of kids who have slower processing. In terms of language processing, it's a little bit difficult for us to know. There's not great research on that. And a lot of times kids with slower language processing get speech and language services. So by the time I see them, they're part of our research. It's not it's not as clear to know what is the complete overlap. We can say, though, that a significant number of kids with slower processing speed have problems with language processing and vice versa. So these three things very often run together: slow processing speed, ADHD, language disorders. And together you can see where any one of these points when you're thinking like, I thought things would be different, you've got to think, okay, so why isn't this working? Is it because of attention? Is it because the language? Is it because I just need to give the child more time?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that and for explaining that. One word of encouragement that you'd like to wrap up this conversation with?
Oh, I would say, you know what? I think that there's a lot we can learn from our kids. And a lot of times we're always looking at like what we have to teach them. But in some ways, there's some things that we can sort of learn from them at sort of like, how can we become more patient? How can we become more insightful into our own behavior? You know, at some time in the future, most of these kids that we're talking about will be independent adults with families of their own. And we will have, be on our own. And there's things that we can learn now that can affect our future too.
I love that. That's such an inspirational thought. Thank you for that. So, Pleasure, where can people find you online?
So if you look up ellenbraatenphd.com, you'll see my website. And yeah, I think that's probably the easiest way to look for it. And there are a lot of links on there to things that I've written and books, and we'll post this on there as well. So.
Awesome. And I found it incredibly helpful to read that book on processing speed, especially just understanding my own family and getting even more tips on what to do once you recognize that. So thank you for the work that you do and for coming on here and sharing with us. And yeah, just appreciate you and your contribution to helping people enjoy their lives and live more fully.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. We'll talk to you later.